welcome to this month's Rights in Russia English interview. Today is January 29th, and our guest today is Grigory Vaypan, a human rights lawyer and scholar and a senior lawyer at Memorial, one of Russia's oldest human rights organizations. Originally from Moscow, Grigory is a graduate of Moscow State University, of Harvard Law School, and St. Petersburg State University. He has also been a Galina Starovoitova Fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington and a Democracy Fellow with the Center of European Policy Analysis. In addition, he's worked at the Institute for Law and Public Policy, a Moscow-based nonprofit where he was involved in developing nonprofit jurisprudence related to human rights cases before the Constitutional Court. Grigory currently lives in Montenegro and continues to work for Memorial as a senior lawyer, carrying out litigation, legal research, and legal advocacy on transitional justice in Russia. He was one of the lawyers representing Memorial at the Russian Supreme Court in the lawsuit brought by prosecutors to close down the organization. We last spoke with Grigory in December 2021, when these legal proceedings were in full swing. Memorial was closed down shortly thereafter in early 2022. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Grigory.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for having me.
As one of Memorial's leading lawyers for a number of years now, how has your life changed since the organization was closed down in Russia?
Well, the most obvious change is that now I'm no longer in Russia, but working in exile. And this is not only my personal fate, but also that of many of my colleagues at Memorial. Since 2022, the human rights situation in Russia has deteriorated badly and quite rapidly in the context of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So in 2022, it was still possible for some of us to remain in the country. In 2024, it is no longer so. However, we do continue our work, and we can certainly talk more about that.
Okay. Could you just recap for us of the grounds on which the authorities closed down Memorial?
Memorial's forced dissolution case in 2021 and 2022, initiated by the Russian government, was the first case in which a Russian NGO, in fact, two Russian NGOs, two Memorial flagship organizations, were disbanded solely for allegedly violating the so-called foreign agents law. The foreign agents law is a series of pieces of legislation that the Russian government has introduced since 2012 in Russia, and that has increasingly stigmatized and repressed civil society organizations. Particularly in the case of Memorial, the allegation was that Memorial did not label all of its publications on the internet and offline with a foreign agent label. It is a stigmatizing label that all foreign agent organizations are required to put on all of their publications in Russia. So Memorial was closed down for, if I'm not mistaken, for a dozen or so publications out of thousands on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, a handful of publications where there were no foreign agent labels, and we built our defense on not so much on arguing about the specifics of the label and where exactly it was supposed to be put and whether it was put correctly or framed correctly, but rather on the fact that the entire foreign agent law is discriminatory and is not consistent with international law.
So you yourself were designated a foreign agent in 2024 and fined 30,000 rubles, about $300 US, for breaking the law, breaking the rules under the foreign agent law. Could you tell us something about why you as an individual were declared a foreign agent?
Yeah, it happened because I am a public speaker. I write and I speak on matters of rule of law and human rights in Russia. And under current Russian law as it stands in 2024, it is enough to speak publicly on matters of the rule of law and human rights to be branded a foreign agent. Russian foreign agent law has been expanded quite fascinatingly since 2012. And in its current version, it no longer requires someone to receive foreign funding or engage in political activity. Those were the initial preconditions for the foreign agent status. But the law is much broader now, and basically anyone can be branded a foreign agent in Russia these days. What is sufficient under the law is that someone is under foreign influence and engages in some kind of public activity. So in my case, as we know from litigation that is now underway before a Russian court, the reason for including me in the list of foreign agents was a number of my personal posts on Facebook and a number of media comments, and also one at my participation in one memorial event, a conference in Paris last spring. So, like I said, anyone can be labeled a foreign agent these days. If you use Facebook, you're under foreign influence.
And so, what kind of impact is this having on lawyers and legal practice and civil society generally in Russia? Is that, does it extend beyond human rights advocates?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So by 2024, the foreign agent law has really become an instrument of full-fledged segregation. It's not only about stigmatizing civil society organizations. It's about repressing and restricting rights of not just organizations, but unincorporated entities, media outlets, and individuals. So if you are a foreign agent, you are required to submit lengthy reports about your everyday spending. You cannot. You obviously you have to label any posts or publications, but there are a number of restrictions. You cannot hold rallies. You cannot run for office. You cannot teach. And one of the latest developments of the foreign agent law that has just come into force is that if you're in Russia, you basically cannot earn any money. Well, you can have a salary, but any other income you cannot really earn. You're required to open up a dedicated bank account. Any income apart from salaries that a foreign agent gets goes into that bank account and becomes frozen. So that might sound ridiculous and absurd in the 21st century, but this is how Russian government treats anyone it does not like. So as a foreign agent, you well, that's basically civil death. I mean, you cannot live in Russia. You don't have enough money to buy your groceries.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea behind the law is to either make sure that people shut up, or force them into exile, or imprison them, because those few people who choose not to comply with the foreign agent law are subject to sanctions, which increase over time. So, like you mentioned, I was lately fined for roughly $300 for not registering myself as a foreign agent. But then every time I post something and not label my publication with a stigmatizing label saying I'm a foreign agent and I'm under foreign influence, I get a new fine. And it's a kind of a 3 strikes rule. You got 3 fines and there's a criminal case and you can be jailed.
Do you have any sense of how many people have been declared foreign agents in Russia? I mean, what's the percentage, say in the legal community? Is it a common designation?
So there's a total of roughly 900 entities and individuals who have been branded foreign agents since 2012. If we deduct the number of those who have been removed from that list, or entities that have to dissolve themselves under pressure, then the current number of foreign agents stands at about 500.
Okay.
And there are lawyers on this list as well. some of my colleagues and friends. So yeah, the government has been increasingly targeting not just human rights organizations, but also human rights lawyers in their individual capacity.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to Memorial. We haven't talked about what has become of the organization, its offices, and its archives.
So Memorial continues to operate in Russia. It might sound surprising, but there are a number of Memorial entities that used to operate in Russia prior to those dissolution cases, and they were not the subject of the two dissolution cases. Like I mentioned, only two leading Memorial entities were disbanded at the time. There are many other Memorial legal entities that continue to operate, and there are some brave people on the ground who continue to do archival work, research, and some legal work. But in addition to that, many of my colleagues at Memorial had to leave the country and had to reestablish Memorial outside of Russia. So these days, you would find Memorial offices in places like Paris or Berlin or Geneva or Vilnius. So it has become more international in a sense, but it used to be an international movement since its inception in late 1980s. So in a sense, not much has changed. The physical location of many people has changed, but the spirit of the organization that has always promoted accountability and awareness of Russia's troubled past and present has not changed.
Mm-hmm. And are the archives in electronic form?
A lot of archives have been digitized. Some have been relocated. So it's easier in this digital era to preserve many of the archives that Memorial maintains.
In the fall of last year, the prosecutor's office in Russia began moves to reassess the rehabilitation of the victims of Stalin-era repressions. Could you maybe expand on just what rehabilitation of victims means in this context and speak to the further developments that there may have been and the significance of those developments?
Right. Yeah, it's been a significant development. Last fall, there's a 1991 law in Russia that is supposed to provide remedies to victims of Soviet-era persecution. So we're in this weird situation where where Russia is committing crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and egregious violations of human rights on a daily basis today. But at the same time, we have an unaddressed mass of Soviet-era crimes for which many victims have not been compensated and that have not been made public or adjudicated. So there's a 1991 law under which the government has acknowledged wrongful convictions or some other ways of other means of persecution for roughly 4 million people during the Soviet era. And it's only a fraction of the actual number of Soviet-era victims. Memorial estimates there's at least 12 million people who were persecuted in the Soviet times. So about a third of those people were acknowledged as victims of wrongful convictions or other forms of persecution. In Russian law, rehabilitation means people get this acknowledgement, or their relatives or descendants get this official acknowledgement from the state, and some kinds of remedies, which might be some negligible monetary compensation, which in Russia, as of now, still amounts to about $1 per 1 month spent in the Gulag, the Soviet concentration camps. So if you are a survivor of the Gulag, you're entitled to a one-time lump sum compensation of roughly $1 per 1 month spent in detention.
Wow.
So what the prosecutor general's office announced last fall is that it will review the cases of those people, some of the cases of the people that same office rehabilitated in 1990s and early 2000s with with the prospect that some or many of those rehabilitation decisions might be and are actually being reversed. So what we know right now, as of now, is that the prosecutors' offices have already reversed rehabilitation decisions for at least 4,000 people, and it might sound like a very negligible fraction of the actual number of victims. But I think that the danger of this ongoing process, and perhaps mm, the whole idea with which this process was initiated, is to cast doubt on the entire rehabilitation agenda, to show that, mistakes were made. People that the government named victims of persecution 20, 25, 30 years ago are not in fact victims, but might be criminals. And this by just casting doubt on the integrity of the process, the government exonerates its own wrongdoing, its own past wrongdoing, because it plants this idea in the minds of the Russian people that what we know as Soviet-era persecution, purges, might not amount to crimes of the state. It might be something more ambiguous. And Vladimir Putin and his government has traded ambiguity for decades. It has His propaganda has been very successful in persuading Russians that there's no such thing as right or wrong, that there's no truth, and everything, people shouldn't trust anyone. And dismantling the rehabilitation agenda of the 1990s is very much instrumental to Putin's government committing new crimes these days in Ukraine and in Russia.
Mhm.
So what happened and what continues to happen with Soviet era victims, and how the government now reverses their rehabilitation, is not so much is a process that happens not so much for the sake of history, but it happens for the sake of new crimes that the state continues to commit.
Sure. Right. I know that you're involved in cases regarding compensation in a number of places. And this year, the Moscow City Court ruled that city authorities must purchase an apartment for a 76-year-old Elizaveta Mikhailova, whose family had lost their Moscow home when they were sent to the Gulag under Stalin. What can you tell us about this case?
Oh, it's a fascinating case. It's ongoing, and I'm very happy for Yelizaveta Mikhailova, who we have worked with for the past 7 years,
Yeah.
to get her that compensation. This judgment is not final yet, and the city authorities said they would appeal the judgment. But I should tell you that Yelizaveta Mikhailova has been pursuing this case for more than 34 years.
Well,
It's how long I've lived on this planet, and it just think of this, number: 34 years. She, as a victim of Soviet era crimes, has been pursuing what she is entitled to under law, because the government doesn't want to spend a penny on the children of the Gulag, of which she is one. This case, the judgment that you just mentioned, is one in a series of many court judgments and decisions that we fought for the past 7 years. But in large part, it all has become possible due to a 2019 judgment by the Russian Constitutional Court, which uh, uh, which kind of facilitated and sent a message to lower authorities and lower courts that they should fast track compensation for children of the Gulag. And even despite that ruling by Russia's top court, we've seen a lot of resistance by the authorities, by the executive offices all across the country, and we have to resort. We have to again and again. We have to go back to courts, to lower courts. We have to resort to litigation, and sometimes we're successful. And that case shows that even despite the grave human rights situation that Russia is in right now, there are some openings and some ways around the repressive state that we human rights lawyers can sometimes find. So sometimes there are wins, and sometimes there are ways to frame cases that might provide a successful outcome.
On the other side, we also read about statues of Stalin that are being put up in other places. I mean, do you see this as a general revitalization of the cult of Stalin in Russia?
I would say it's not so much a cult of Stalin as a cult of state impunity. So what this has to do is state impunity. The Soviet state got away with its crimes. Russian state is committing crimes, international crimes, violations of human rights these days. And Stalin is just a symbol of that impunity. And reason those statues and other forms of an acknowledgement for Stalin pop up here and there is because people who support Stalin, and many Russians still do, they feel this climate of impunity in the air. They can sense it, they can breathe it, and they're not afraid to do that. So all those initiatives that we've seen, those are largely private initiatives, but people who come up with them, they can feel that this is something that the state supports, endorses. I mean, just a few days ago, Moscow State University, my alma mater, university I graduated from roughly 15 years ago, held a 270 anniversary celebrations of its existence at the Kremlin, at a concert hall in the Kremlin. And there have been some performances, and that showed the history of the university. And one of the performances during that show was about the mid-20th century, and there was a big portrait of Stalin in the background, and people were marching, posing as Soviet-era students, but there was a big face of Stalin in the background. And the fact that the organizers chose that background and not some other kind of background is really shameful. It's really a shame that my university uses Stalin at its own official event, but it shows the kind of era that we go through right now. Again, it's not about history, it's about the present.
In terms of freedom of expression, to what extent do you think there is freedom of expression in Russia right now, in the current times?
Right now, there's wartime censorship in Russia. So since 2022, the situation with freedom of speech and freedom of expression more generally has deteriorated very badly. You can be fined and imprisoned for saying that you oppose the war. Sometimes one can be fined or arrested for just wearing the wrong colors of clothes in a street, and that happened to someone recently. It's just unimaginable that a case like that could happen 5 or 10 years ago. But someone went to the police station to report a case of robbery and was arrested himself because the color of his clothes was yellow and blue, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. So it was just a mundane case of robbery that someone went to report to the police, but got persecuted because he was wearing the wrong kind of clothes. So that is the state of the freedom of expression in Russia today.
To think about another case that might bear on this question. In January, there were 3 lawyers who'd acted for Alexei Navalny that were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment for extremism. Could you tell us something about this case and what the significance of this is, kind of politically and socially?
Right, right. Yeah, well, this is also a significant development and an important, sadly important case, in which lawyers have been sentenced to lengthy prison terms for doing their job. If you read the judgment of the court, then the allegations against them are simply that they met with their client, late Alexei Navalny, in prison and took notes and had a conversation with them. They did their job, and the government pursued them, prosecuted and punished them for the same crime that their client was convicted of. Alexei Navalny was convicted of a number of crimes in unfair trials in Russia, and there were brave lawyers who defended him. And now those lawyers are behind bars as well. We've seen something like that in Belarus as well, where authorities went so far as to imprison a lawyer of a lawyer of a lawyer of someone from the opposition. So there's a long chain you can go down the road, right? And the purpose of a case like this is to frighten other human rights lawyers and other lawyers who might work on political cases. And this already has an impact. It is already increasingly difficult to find a defense attorney for someone who is being accused of treason or war criticism or foreign agent law violations or some other laws that the government has put in place recently to persecute its opponents and the civil society.
In terms of the courts, you mentioned the Constitutional Court ruling. To what extent can lawyers depend on the courts as they bring cases?
The space for meaningful human rights litigation has shrunk dramatically in the recent years. So I always, when we speak about Russia, I always say that we should view authoritarian countries like Russia in dynamically. So it's not the same in 2024 as it was in 2010 or 2015. It's a situation that changes, that evolves over time, one way or another. So when I began my human rights career in 2013, it was a different country in many ways. And the space for human rights action was much bigger. It was much broader. We could litigate cases at the Constitutional Court that we cannot now. I mean, we can, but we know what the outcome is going to be. We won that Children of the Gulag case in 2019. It was a big win, and it was only 5 years ago. I could not imagine a case like this being successfully litigated at the Constitutional Court today. In 2017, the Constitutional Court found in favor of Ildar Dadin, who was Russia's first political prisoner under a 2014 criminal law that effectively criminalized any kind of peaceful protest. Ildar Dadin was acquitted as a result. He was liberated and got compensation for wrongful conviction. Again, the Constitutional Court would not be able to issue this kind of ruling today. In fact, just 2 years ago, in 2023, we had a case at the Constitutional Court about wartime censorship, and we challenged a domestic law that outlawed any kind of criticism of the Russian armed forces in the context of their aggression against Ukraine. The Constitutional Court dismissed those 20 applications that we filed and dismissed them summarily, which showed that the court didn't even want to hold a hearing on a case. It seemed clear-cut to the court. So a lot has changed, and it's not just the Russian war. It's Russian war against Ukraine. It's been a downward spiral over all those years. It's been perhaps the worst decade to be a human rights lawyer in Russia. So I keep thinking, maybe if I began my human rights career, 20 years earlier, things might have turned out somewhat differently in my country. Not just myself, but my colleagues and friends as well. So it's been a downward spiral of which, say, the 2020 constitutional amendments played a role too. They shrunk the role of the constitutional court and made judges more afraid.
Mhm. And so for my last question, do you have a sense of the course of events? What course will events take in the future as you're carrying out your mission from afar right now? What do you think that about the chances that you'll be able to return to Russia and Memorial as well?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen. We'll be back. We will prevail. We're now going through the dark times. It's important that Russian civil society survives these dark times and continues to operate both institutionally and on on a personal level, that people don't quit. It's essential. And we can still help people who are in Russia. We can still help political prisoners. We can still advocate for them. We can still do research into policy avenues for a future Russia. And well, we're not alone. I mean, we support each other, and we know that the international community supports Russian civil society. Many organizations, many governments support Russian civil society, and we're thankful for that. And we're also reminded on a daily basis that we're also not alone when it comes to troubling developments in other countries around the world. I mean, there are democratic countries, some of them, that that you know uh, experience uh, political developments that might not always go in the right direction. So it's essential that we all, human rights lawyers around the world, civil society around the world, that we stick together, and that we support each other. We note those worrying trends, so we as Russian lawyers can testify, and we can see those trends because we've experienced that in our own country. And we should work together to make sure um, that we get back on track when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to human rights, and specifically with regard to Russia, that the war in Ukraine ends and there's just peace, which means complete deoccupation of Ukraine, which means reparation to Ukraine, and which also means we should reform Russia. For a Russia after Putin that will eventually come about, we should start thinking right now about how we will reform Russia to make sure that Russia does not commit new crimes, and that it will no longer be a threat to the world and international peace and security as well.
Well, thank you so much, Grigory Vaypan, for an illuminating and inspiring conversation today. It's heartening that you continue to do your work, even in exile, and we hope to see you again in Rights in Russia in better times. Thank
Thank
you
you so
so
much.
much.
Thank you, Mary.
Yes.